Welcome to the 1960s Project. The 1960s Project brings you voices of the 1960s. We've been recalling, remembering, and reflecting on events of the 1960s. My name is Jerome Page, and I'm your host for this evening's show. This evening's live is the third for the month of May, and it's also our third one on Malcom X. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we move into the show. We're in season 2, session 19. Our guest today, and I'll introduce him more fully later, but our guest today was the president of the Howard University Student Council when in October 1961, Malcom X and Bayard Rustin debated each other on the campus of Howard University. So we'll be thinking about and remembering and getting reflections on that debate in October of 1961. Before I introduce today's guests, I have 4 asks of everyone. I would like for you to like and follow us on Facebook. The second ask is to subscribe to our YouTube channel. The third ask is to read and comment on our blogs. And since this is social media, my fourth ask is for you to share our shows, videos, and blogs. Born in New York City, Michael R. Winston received his secondary education at the Stuyvesant High School. He was awarded the Bachelor of Arts degree in History, magna cum laude, by Howard University in 1962, and elected to Phi Beta Kappa. He then attended the University of Edinburgh as a Moten Fellow to study British intellectual and social history. From 1969 to 1970, he was a Ford Foundation Faculty Fellow to undertake research in Vienna. The award of a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship and a John Hay Whitney Fellowship enabled him to complete graduate work in European history at the University of California, Berkeley. At the University of California, Berkeley, he was awarded an MA degree in French history, and in 1964, he got his MA in 1964, and in 1974, he got a PhD in European history. In 2008, Rollins College awarded him the degree of Doctor of Humane Letters, honoris causa, and an honorary degree of Doctor of Humane Letters was also awarded to him by Howard University in 2019. And we'll hear more about Dr. Michael R. Winston and Howard University as the show progresses. Welcome, Dr. Winston.
Oh, it's nice to be with you.
So I'll dispense with the formalities. Is it okay for me to call you Michael?
Yes, it is. We've only known each other for more than 50 years.
Okay. Well, we'll talk about how that happened later.
Okay.
So how did you become president of the Howard University Student Council?
Well, there were very formal elections, and the process was one of eager campaigning and speeches and rallies. There are photographs of me campaigning that many people wouldn't believe were real. If they knew me in my professorial role, they would not see me as a student politician. But I got the most votes, and that's how I became president. But I should say something about the Liberal Arts Student Council.
Okay.
Howard University had, in those days, 10 schools and colleges, and each had a student council. Liberal arts happened to be the most influential student council because it had the largest student body and the largest budget, because your budget was determined by the enrollment of the school where you were president of the student council. Beyond that, there had been a long tradition of student government being dominated by the Greek letter organizations. And then in the mid 1950s, there was what was called the Revolt of the Intellectuals. And the grade point average required to run for office was increased rather steeply. And then non-Greeks had a chance at political office. And I had been very impressed with the people I had seen as presidents of the Liberal Arts Student Council, particularly Timothy L. Jenkins, who was president in 1960 and one of the leaders of SNCC. And so it was not something out of the way. If you got into that role, you learned a great deal about not only the university, but about budgets and management and many other things. And the platform I ran on was one of engagement with the larger world, because I thought that too many institutions, student government was about organizing fun. And I thought, given our situation as Black people in the United States, we needed to do more than organize pageants and the May Queen and things like that. So that was the platform, and then it was my job to try to make that happen.
What years were you on the campus as an undergraduate?
4 years, from 1958 to 1962.
And when did the revolt of the intellectuals take place?
That was 1956.
Okay.
And, I was the last non-Greek president for a while, because the Greek letter organizations started admitting students with higher grade point averages. And the thought was on campus that was the way they were going to get back into campus politics. But along the way, the student revolution happened, and Greek letter organizations were pushed aside by new identification with the Black consciousness movement. And Howard was a center of that, but that is much later. The very name of the program we started, Project Awareness, was trying to make people aware, people on the campus, aware of we thought what were burning issues.
And what were some of those issues? You mentioned that your overall platform was engaging the larger world. What were some of the issues on campus and off campus that the student government addressed?
Well, off campus, we thought that Howard students should be much more aware of decolonization in the world. The Bandung Conference in Indonesia had been held just the year before I entered Howard. President Sukarno invited to Indonesia all the representatives of the non-white peoples of the world. And that was a very dramatic move that many people in the United States were startled by. But there were many professors on campus who were enthusiastic about Bandung. And you remember that in 1957, the Gold Coast became Ghana. And then in 1960, Nigeria received its independence. And I would say the average Howard student, the average American student at Howard at that time, was not very engaged in African ideas. They certainly saw African students. There were students at Howard from 90 countries and about 48 states. So it was a very diverse student body, but there was not, as far as I was concerned, much understanding of decolonization and what was going to be the struggle with what was already being identified as neo-colonialism under different guise. And I must say,
jumping ahead, you would eventually teach a course called Modern Revolutions and Liberation Movements, if I remember correctly.
Well, I hope you remember because you were a student in it. But it was quite a venture because it was introduced at a volatile time, and I introduced it because I thought we had students talking about being revolutionaries, and quite frankly, I didn't think they were very clear about what a revolution is and in what context one would talk about revolution as distinct from a rebellion and insurrection or revolt and so on. I also wanted them to understand things comparatively. And now whether the course was successful or not, I don't know. It was one of the most difficult courses I ever taught in my life. But anyway, I enjoyed it also a great deal.
Well, for some reason, you know how the mind works, suddenly Barrington Moore's book popped into my brain.
Yeah.
I haven't thought about Barrington Moore in 60 years, but I remember that being one of the books that I learned a lot from. So I'll have to Google him and figure out what I remembered and what I've forgotten about that. So those were the broader issues off campus, engaging the global world. What were some of the campus issues that the student council dealt with?
There were issues about representation of students in university. We weren't talking yet about policy, but we were talking about having a voice. And fortunately, in 1960, Dean James M. Nabrett Jr. he was the dean of the law school, and he had been secretary of the board of trustees since 1938. And when he spoke at his inauguration, he said he wanted to have students much more involved in university decision-making. And as a kind of good faith indication of what he was talking about, for the first, and I must say it was also the last time in university history, he asked a student and a faculty member to be Charter Day speakers. And he chose me. I still do not know how he came to that conclusion that I should be the student to speak at Charter Day, since I was a junior in liberal arts. But anyway, he somehow knew about me and asked me to make that speech. And it turned out to be a shocking speech, because I think the expectation was, since I was handpicked, I was going to say something that was very positive about the university's treatment of students. And I made a long list of complaints about students not getting adequate faculty attention. The university enrollment was growing by leaps and bounds. Things were overcrowded and services tended to be irregular and so on. So much of it was the usual kind of complaint at universities at that time. I must say, I did not know that much about American higher education, broadly speaking, but it happened to be a time of great expansion of campuses across the country. It wasn't until I went to the National Student Association convention in Madison, Wisconsin in 1961, the summer between my junior and senior year, that I realized that these issues were all over the country about students wanting more faculty attention and support services and less overcrowding. One issue we did not have, as far as I was concerned, most places had problems about food. We had a very good cafeteria service, and the prices were excellent. So we didn't have the food issue, but we did have issues about what we would now call the quality of student life.
What do you consider one or two major accomplishments under your presidency? But before you answer that, again, you said that each school had a council, and you were the president of the liberal arts.
Right. There was an engineering student council, a medical school student council, dental school, social work. Every school at Howard had a student council.
Was it at any point in Howard's history of student organizations that there became a student council for the university?
And that happened after my time. That started in academic year 63, 64. And so that was the Howard University Student Association. And my reaction to that was that it was going to be unwieldy. And some people in the other schools and colleges thought, well, a liberal arts student would say that because they have had the lion's share of things up to now because of their size. But there was something lost in having the student association. There was more bureaucracy, and because it was a much bigger operation than it had been.
Okay, so can you list one or two accomplishments? And just as for camera purposes, could you kind of lean back a little bit? The light's picking up on your face. There you go. There you go. That's good.
Well, I must say, Project Awareness was probably the most memorable thing, and I can go into how that developed. But we sent students abroad, had a program of student-sponsored scholarships for study abroad, and then for going to other institutions. I thought that in many ways we were too provincial. We had a publication, and we organized a number of non-controversial programs. What I thought was going to be non-controversial turned out to be controversial. We had not had student-sponsored musical events. And when we started getting that organized, the dean of the School of Music, by then called the College of Fine Arts, Dean Warner Lawson, said that in the new auditorium, the Crampton Auditorium had just opened, no jazz could be performed.
Okay.
Only classical music. And so the first thing we were going to sponsor was the Modern Jazz Quartet, because if you remember them, they all came out in tuxedos, and it wasn't anything wild. It was not bebop. It wasn't anything that was going to be hard to take. And then I just took it to President Nabert, and I said, I thought this was part of the College of Fine Arts. Most people think that jazz is the most important modern music to come out of America, and it is played all over the world, and I don't see how that can be reasonable. He okayed it. Dean Lawson was not pleased, but it was very well attended. But just as, should I go into how?
No, we're going to have to get another show on student government, history of student government at Howard. But in 1961, you sponsored the student council, the Liberal Arts Student Council, sponsored a debate between Malcom X and Bayard Rustin. And in a retrospective article in 2007, they referred to it as Malcolm at the Mecca. How did Malcolm X get to the Mecca? And
well, in the first place, no one would have ever said that was a later term that students used because they wanted to project the idea that Howard was to the Black world what Mecca was to Muslims. In those days, we called it the capstone. It was called the capstone of Negro education. And certainly Malcolm X would never have gone to any program that was called Mecca at Howard University, okay? So we had a series of debates planned. I mean, one of the other real spectacular debates was on thermonuclear war with Norman Thomas and Dr. Khan debating, and that was a big issue. The Cold War was on, and this was the academic year before the Cuban Missile Crisis, but there were debates about war and peace and about civil rights and so on. But I knew that this was going to be a question of, well, just how much freedom do we have? So I put the Malcom X, Bayard Rustin debate as first, because if we could get that through the process, then all the rest would be relatively easy. Well, as it turned out, when the proposal for the program went, as was the usual procedure, to the Dean of Students' office, it was turned down. So I went to see Dean Blackburn, and he said, well, Mr. Winston, you wouldn't be able to manage a program like that, and we would end up with, I'll never forget these words, surging mobs of students pushing through the gates. Well, so I let that be his last word. Although I did tell him, I said, Dean Blackburn, I am going to appeal this decision. So I went to see Dr. Nabrit. And again, the recollection is very vivid. He was in his presidential office in this large chair. He had a big cigar. And he said, well, now what is this that you propose? So I told him. And he said, well, the Student Life Committee thinks this is not appropriate. I said, President Nabrit, I never thought that a day would come when Howard University would say that Howard students were inferior to white students. And he sat back, he said, what are you saying? I said, well, Mr. X has debated at white universities, has spoken at white universities all over the country. I said, we are not asking him to speak by himself. The debate format was chosen deliberately because we think an important part of an education is hearing different points of view, opposing points of view, and coming to our own decisions about it. Now, when I said that, I knew perfectly well that he had been a constitutional lawyer and he had stood for free speech and so on, and he was not going to be put in a position where I was saying that the university was implying that white students could listen to Malcolm X and be all right, but we couldn't manage to hear him in a debate where an arch integrationist like Bayard Rustin was going to speak. So he paused and took a long draw on his cigar. Then he came straight across his desk at me and he said, okay, you've made your point. And then he paused. But you, Michael Winston, are going to be responsible for whatever happens.
Okay.
So,
there's this, what has turned out to be an iconic picture. I don't know whether Ty can bring the picture up with can you describe what this picture is? Can you just tell us about this picture?
Okay, this is on the stage at Crampton Auditorium. And this was just before the formal debate started. And the photographer had, because Minister Malcolm was in a third chair on the other side. And the photographer asked him to come over and stand between us because I was presiding.
Okay, just for the audience, can you identify the people in the picture? So who's on the right, who's in the center, and who's on the left?
On the left of the photograph is Bayard Rustin, who was well known as being a a member of the Council on Reconciliation, Fellowship of Reconciliation, and very closely identified with A. Philip Randolph. And he was the major planner and logistics coordinator for the March on Washington. And in the center is Minister Malcom X. He was using that name at the time, of course. Later, he changed it to Malik el-Shabazz, but he was still the chief spokesman for the Nation of Islam at that point. And I am the young man sitting there on the right.
Okay, I see everybody has on a suit and tie.
Well, again, this is an indication of the period. You had not seen a dashiki in sight in those days. Howard was a very formal place, but Malcolm X always appeared in suit and tie. And one of the things that I was going to say as a preliminary is that when we talk about the 60s, it's useful to break it up because the decade wasn't homogeneous. It wasn't the same throughout. I think of this period when this debate took place as a continuation of the 1950s.
Well, before you go there, let me set the stage here. I think what you're saying here is as you're looking back, part of it is personal reflection, but also part of it is you're looking back through the lens of a professional historian.
Yes, and that
so what was it? What does that lens? So you're talking through the lens of a professional historian. So Michael R. Winston, the professional historian, you're looking back now. What do you see about the period?
The early 60s were really a continuation of the 1950s. The country was characterized by a new kind of conservatism. The Eisenhower administration was supposed to be a period of regrouping. It turned out that the Eisenhower administration was completely unprepared to deal with civil rights. President Eisenhower had been startled by the crisis at Little Rock when those 9 students were turned away and he had to call in the National Guard. He had really no idea at how much turbulence there was beneath the surface. But the civil rights movement was still dominated by the lawyers. And there was still the idea that we were going to make the most progress by eliminating statutory segregation. And of course, hopes had been raised by the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And there was still a good deal of optimism about that. But by the time this debate took place, there was already an indication that social and economic issues were going to displace civil rights issues in the technical sense. And one of the things about this debate that was in retrospect very interesting was that Malcolm X kept talking about integration. That was the term he wanted to use. And that was a surrender, as far as he was concerned, to white people. It was an indication that we wanted simply to be around white people and to be with white people and to deny ourselves and not to have any race pride. Well, in so many ways, that was a distortion because what was going on, most of us characterized as a freedom movement. And we were interested in in progress of the race, but we didn't see how you could have the progress without getting access to the institutions and resources of the country.
Was that how Bayard Rustin framed the issue, or is this your framing of the issue?
This is the historian framing it, because in terms of impact, Malcom X had the greatest impact between the two. Bayard Rustin had a very odd delivery. He had an affected British accent and sounded a bit out of touch. But what was really going on, and this was clear even then, was that Malcom X was about attacking Martin Luther King Jr. And we now know through the research of Les Payne and other biographers of Malcom X that before this debate in 1960, under the direction and directive of Elijah Muhammad, he had met in Atlanta with the Ku Klux Klan. And this was designed to stop Martin Luther King Jr. Now, again, that relates to the debate in this way. Howard University at that time had several different kinds of names. The law school was called the West Point of the Civil Rights Movement. You went to law school at Howard to focus on that. It was just like a guided missile. And when this debate was announced, the most distinguished historian at the university, Rayford W Logan, used some class time to denounce me and said, Michael Winston has invited a segregationist to come to Howard University, and it's a disgrace. And that was the attitude of many faculty people. That now, I did not know that the Nation of Islam was making alliances with the Ku Klux Klan and had talks with the American Nazis, George Lincoln Rockwell. We didn't know any of that at the time. But I did know that what the university stood for in terms of desegregation was not what they stood for, because Elijah Muhammad's answer to the race issue in the United States was what he called separation. And the debate was framed separation or integration. And what he meant by separation was some land somewhere in the South, and that was supposed to be what we would now call reparation for slavery. Well, there was, all of that was far-fetched, of course. But, and my own belief is that Malcom X was never entirely comfortable with that. Now, the way some biographers have treated him lately, it is that he was totally converted to the religion of Elijah Muhammad, and that only very close to the split, did he become aware of the weaknesses in that position as some kind of solution. But be that as it may, it was, in intellectual terms, the Nation of Islam's position was simply not adequate to what needed to be done.
What was Bayard Rustin's position? If Malcom X was framing it as so you had two lenses so far. One was the lens of integration or for and against integration. One is freedom movement. What was the lens that Bayard Rustin was using in order to articulate his position coming off of the history of A. Philip Randolph?
He was talking about nonviolent protest. He was a pacifist had gone to jail during World War II, protesting the war, and not registering for the Selective Service Act and things like that. And he was a believer in nonviolence. And during the debate, Malcolm X had ridiculed nonviolence, saying, if somebody hits you, you hit them back. And if they use guns, you use guns. Well, there was, at the community level, some respect for the fruit of Islam and the Nation of Islam. They were very neat, and bow ties and well-pressed suits, and they demanded respect. But of course, again, that was not adequate to the complexity of the problem we faced. And I would always put an S on the problem, because our situation has always been that there's been no one thing that has been used against us. It's a whole combination of things, from education to housing and employment and so on. But there was growing frustration in many quarters that we were not making the headway that we had expected.
Well, when did you become aware of Malcolm X?
It was a very interesting thing about it's not exactly equivalent, but the conservative medium that was very powerful in those days was Life magazine, Time magazine and Life magazine. Life magazine reached more households in the United States than any other magazine. It was large format with photographs, and they had done a big spread on what they called the Black Muslims. They did not call them the Nation of Islam. And page after page showing large numbers of Black Muslims, and all in white. And the article was cast in a way that made them, on the one hand, kind of threatening, but also they seemed like some alternative to Martin Luther King and the Southern movement. And I also have to say, I knew about them when I was a youngster. I knew about him because my family lived 2 blocks from where he lived, just on the other side of Northern Boulevard. And we went to the same barbershop, Mr. William Tyson's barbershop. And so I had heard, long before I got to Howard, I had heard him speak in the barbershop. I went to that barbershop because it was a very lively debate society. We had one barber who was very religious. Everybody called him Rev. We had another one who had attended the Jefferson School for Social Science, which was a Marxist continuing education school. And so he was always talking about the evils of capitalism. And then the third barber was the kind of moderator between these two. And people would go into the barbershop just to hear the arguments. And Malcolm X was one of them who would come in and just kind of be amused at the way the thing went, because he spent most of his time in Harlem, but he lived on the other side of Northern Boulevard, which was East Elmhurst, and I lived in Corona. It was divided by this one boulevard. And so he was known in the neighborhood, but he was becoming well known nationally as the spokesman. And of course, that's what, and again, looking at it as a historian, the story of Malcolm X is really a major tragedy, because in his life, he grappled with his circumstances, and what he conquered in terms of himself enabled him to use his ability. The man's intelligence and intensity was extraordinary. I saw it up close at this debate. I decided that though the student council sponsored it, the president should not moderate it. So I presided, introducing people. Interestingly, when I started asking faculty people to moderate it, one after another said no, they would not do it. And they let me know very clearly they were not coming to the debate. Not only would they not moderate it, they would not put their foot in Crampton Auditorium. So I decided, okay, I'll just take a chance. I did not know him personally. I'd seen him in Douglass Hall, but I went to Professor Emmett Edward Dorsey, known on campus as Sam Dorsey, one of the most brilliant political scientists in the country. And I told him what my problem was, that no faculty member would agree because it was too controversial. He said, Winston, that's ridiculous. I'll do it. So he was famous on campus for this enormous vocabulary and dealing with very complicated constructions and in language and very dense theories. He had been a very enthusiastic Marxist.
This is Dorsey. This is Dorsey, Professor Dorsey.
This is Professor Dorsey. So
okay.
At the dinner, and we always had a dinner before. We'd invite faculty and other people and so on, and of course students. I was annoyed at first because I had gone to great trouble to talk with the cafeteria people that all of the food would have no pork. None of the greens would have any pork in it or pork fat and all that. And I had gotten all this information on what he would eat and so forth. He came in and he had Fruit of Islam people with him. All of these guys, huge guys, stood around the wall. They refused to sit. They stood, and he sat. I had him sit on one side, and Rustin and Professor Dorsey was facing him, and he refused to eat. And there was a strange tenseness about the thing. So Professor Dorsey it was obvious he had nothing but contempt in terms of political thought and analysis and all of that, nothing but contempt for the whole Black Muslim phenomenon. So he asked this question, and the question must have had 6 different parts, and he used some terms that most people would find very unfamiliar. And so I saw Minister Malcom X squint, and after this long preamble to the question, he said, Professor, you know, I never went to college, so you're going to have to break that down for me before I can answer. Well, Dorsey looked ridiculous because it was obvious that he had been showing off, trying to show up this man, and Malcolm X just got the best of them because he made it clear. As he talked, you could tell that he had a very, I'd call it a rapid, facile mind. And if you look at his life, he educated himself as far as one can do that if they are under the conversion spell. And one of the things that
what made it tragic?
And this is what I think was tragic. He was gifted, and he became the greatest spokesman the organization ever had, because
that's the Nation of Islam.
Yeah, the Nation of Islam was founded in 1913 and had remained an obscure sect. Most people didn't have any idea about W.D. Fard, who's often given credit for founding it, but even before Fard, there was someone named Noble Moorish Temple of Science. Well, and make the movement known all over the country, and then after a while, all over the world. And that created jealousy in the Chicago headquarters. And they really had a monarchical arrangement there. And Elijah Muhammad's family was jealous of Malcolm X, and that jealousy became toxic, and which led eventually to his assassination. So the more, why I call it tragic, is his gifts then became the source of his destruction. And one of the things that Les Payne does very well as a biographer is he shows that it was the religious aspect of it that kept Malcolm X bound for so long. But then once his disillusionment came, and the directive to meet with the Ku Klux Klan was the most unsettling thing in that relationship. And once Elijah Muhammad had met with George Lincoln Rockwell and so on. So, and the other thing that makes it very tragic to me is that after he broke with the nation and then went to Mecca and had this first experience with Orthodox Islam and saw white people and Black people and Asian people in the same space in Mecca, and he thought that such a thing was impossible because he had divided the world into Black people and white people, which was consistent with how he was raised. His parents were Garveyites. He lost his father when he was very young, but the influence of Marcus Garvey was in the family. And so when Malcolm X talked about the white man, all caps, he really meant it. He did not see distinctions among white people, and he thought that Black people needed to have the same understanding, as he always put it, as the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, because the Honorable Elijah Muhammad had seen the way for the future. And because he was the messenger of that was supposed. So, and then he comes out of this and he lives only 1 year. So, he meets Black expatriates in Ghana, and he begins to see, these are people, he met Maya Angelou and James Baldwin and other people who had a very different view of the world than he had, but he didn't live very long to do that.
Let's go back to the point about the education of him and his self-education. That notion of the self-education has been partly challenged by the new book, The Three Mothers, which examines the life of the influence of the mother of Malcolm X, the mother of James Baldwin, and the mother of Martin Luther King. And in that book, it details how Louise Little, his mother, really shaped the foundation for her kids. And it was off of that base that he began to draw once he got to prison. So in one sense, though he didn't have much in the way of education beyond a certain level, his homeschooling around his father, the participation in the Garvey movement, the radical view of the world that his mother had, she shaped the worldview of the kids and taught them how to learn. And it was that when he was in prison, he returned to that, and then that was the base on which he began to grow and expand his knowledge. It wasn't the learning based on the Nation of Islam, but it was the learning based on what his mother had established for him and his brothers and sisters. So that we went through that discussion last week on the discussion of the three mothers. So that was, so it's there's a new view of how Malcolm X became educated. Clearly, when he was in prison, he spent his time reading, but the foundations of that had been set as a kid growing up in the household with his mother, which is another story. Malcolm X becomes a postage stamp. How did that happen?
I know the process. The Black Heritage series has.
Well, let me reframe it. Is that what's in the nature of the social process that he goes from this person who is viewed as somebody who is hate-filled, and now he's on a stamp for the U.S. Postal Service. Not what's the mechanism for him getting chosen.
Right. Well, what happened as a process was that more and more people began to see themselves, without reading any treatise about it or anything, that the liberation struggle of Black Americans has been influenced in many different ways by different people. And while you get the emergence of a particular figure at one time, the differences they have with each other and so on tend to fall away into insignificance once you frame it more widely. And one of the things I saw in the late 60s, early 70s, posters with Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, all kinds of people who had no compatibility with each other at the time of their activity, but looking at our collective experience as a people, they become icons either of a particular period. I mean, you get some like Langston Hughes or Alain Locke, who are iconic for the Harlem Renaissance. And then after you get enough distance from the Harlem Renaissance, they become figures in Negro literature. And then you get some more distance and you see that they influence American and world literature. So that Toni Morrison, who studied with Sterling Brown at Howard University, Toni Morrison was not just a local writer, a local color writer. She was not just an American writer. She became a global influence. You can see her books in multiple languages all over the world. And so Malcolm X, I think, became widely admired, not because of certain specific beliefs he had, but what he represented as energy and a militancy. And I would say it was against the backdrop of the Northern and Midwestern urban environment. Because one of the things that is very clear about the 1960s, if you remember, Dr. King was very successful in Montgomery, in Atlanta, in other places in the South, cities in the South. When he went to Chicago, he was totally ineffective. He was completely shocked by the white violence that he encountered in Chicago. Malcolm X was not at home in the large urban South. They had a few temples in Atlanta and some other cities, but these were people were isolated. When Malcolm X criticized Black people for being Christians and talked about Christianity as the white man's religion and the church is the white man's church, well, people rejected that because he couldn't erase the Black church going back to the 17th century on these shores. and the leadership in our education that came from the AME Church and the AME Zion Church, and what we had built here. And of course, the church was our most important social institution. We wouldn't have had schools if it hadn't been for the Black church. Our first institution of higher education was Wilberforce. And Bishop Daniel Payne was the greatest educator we ever had. Although few people know it, but the reality was we would not have had an educated clergy in the AME church without him. So it's a very strange mixture in this process where people with enough time and distance begin to not only see people as, well, the old term used to be heroes and heroines. When Dr. Carter G. Woodson started Negro History Week, you would have these books. One by Benjamin Brawley was very popular, called Negro Heroes and Heroines. And there was a little portrait and brief sketch of each of them. And as kids, that's what we would see. Well, that is a popular way of looking at Black history. Initially, these are our heroes and heroines. And then it gets to be real history, it's complicated because all of these figures have complications. So for some people, Frederick Douglass is a hero until they find out about his second wife. You know, his second wife was white. And they can't quite put that together. How did he rise from slavery? And he's got a Black wife and Black children and so forth. And then he marries Helen Pitts. Well, Mr. Douglass, being always very quick on his feet, he said, I had two wives. One followed the race of my mother and one followed the race of my father. And so.
Well, I'm going to paraphrase the question a little differently. I think you've already touched on it. But what do you see as the lasting significance of Malcolm X? And then what would he say about Black Lives Matter, and what can we learn from studying and reflecting on his life?
Well, I really don't know what he would say, but I think he was a very significant voice of people who were at the lowest end of the economic distribution. And one of the things that the period teaches us is that, in fact, the legal struggle against segregation was successful. That opened doors in higher education, to employment, and so on. But a solid 1/3 of us were left behind. And some of that was because many people in our leadership thought of it only as civil rights. Okay, so once you win the legal battle, you've won. And they did not have what was called, way back then, a progressive view of the socioeconomic struggle. So you could get many successful Black people who then would start reciting, their up from their own bootstraps. I did it myself. I just worked hard and that's why I'm successful. And these other people, are just left behind and it's their fault. Well, I've never believed that. And our struggle has got to include a socioeconomic platform. And so the pure civil rights part of it is not adequate. And the Black pride part of it is not adequate by itself. And having positive views about Africa is not adequate by itself. It requires all of those things, but particularly understanding how the United States managed to maintain racial domination in a so-called democratic system. And it could be as democratic as we please. If we don't do anything about the economic system and the social distribution of benefits in the society, we will have a problem we will continue to call a race problem when that's not really what it is. That covers up many things. And so I think that.
before you finish that point, we got one question here. It says, I asked Dr. Winston if he was perceived as a campus radical at Howard. Were you perceived as a campus radical?
No. The period of campus radicals really hadn't happened yet. That again, it's just to put this in context. I graduated in 1962, went to graduate school, came back in 1964 as a member of the faculty, and it was still the same Howard I had known. Then I went back to Berkeley in 66. And in 1968, just 2 years after I had left the campus, I got a call from President Nabert saying, I need you to come back to Howard. And I said, Dr. Nabert, I can't come back. I am on my way to Vienna. He said, we need you now because we're in the midst of a revolution. And so he came up with the most unlikely appointment. I was 27 years old and he appointed me assistant dean of the College of Liberal Arts. And I had just been a student not too long before and had been a very junior faculty member. I was an instructor. When I got to campus, I did not know the place. In 1968, I didn't recognize the way the students looked, had big afros, and Howard being Howard, the question about who was going to have the biggest one, who's going to have the most stylish afro, but whatever they had, it was going to be an afro. And they had dashikis. The question was not whether they were just going to take suits off and so on, because we had kids in Brooks Brothers suits at one time. Who had the most authentic or the best looking dashiki, and Negroes had disappeared. Everybody was black, okay? And the formality of the campus had been changed, and students were very aggressive. I mean, in that, the first time I offered modern revolutions and liberation movements, there's a young man sitting in the front row of the class, and he says to me, what makes you think you know anything about revolution? How can you teach this class? Were you ever a revolutionary? So I said, I have never been in a revolution. I said, and you raise a very important epistemological question. How do we know anything? I said, I happen to know something about revolutions because of the academic study of it. I said, that doesn't mean that I know from personal experience how it works, but I have a wider knowledge than that because we are going to, in this class, study the English Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, and then we're going to study liberation movements. He said, well, when are we going to study the Black Revolution? I said, we haven't had one yet. And you will see why if you stay in the class, because this is not show business. You don't have a revolution by changing your hairstyle or putting on different clothes. I said, that can be a major change in consciousness, but you cannot overturn power and money with a show, a pageant. Well,
here, yeah, okay, but before we go on, we're extending the time a little bit, but let me clarify a historical point. You mentioned Wilberforce, and somebody says that Lincoln University was the first African-American university. Did you mean to say that Wilberforce was the first African-American university?
Wilberforce was called a university before Lincoln. Lincoln was founded as Ashman Institute. And like many institutions founded at the time, it was founded by white missionaries. Most of them were Princeton faculty. They were Presbyterians. And so they created the foundation and soon became Lincoln University. But Wilberforce was founded as a university. And of course, it was already built. He bought it from the White Methodist Church. But when you get to the question of which is first, you have to look at what it was at the time of its founding. So,
and at the time of the founding, Lincoln was how did you describe it?
Ashland Institute, and it was a college preparatory institution because they were teaching Latin and Greek, but they had not yet gotten to the collegiate level.
And what was Wilberforce at its founding?
It started out as an institution of higher education. Okay. And that is because Bishop Payne wanted to get people into clergy as soon as possible, so they had to start with the college. And then, of course, now there are some. Howard University was founded as a university, not a college, and it had a medical school, law school, a college, and they had normal school, which was a teacher training institution. But Cheney, for example, right now, says it is the oldest because it uses 1837 as its founding date. Well, in 1837, it was in Philadelphia as the Institute for Colored Youth. And it was one of the best prep schools in the country. And then it became Cheney later when the state of Pennsylvania had to figure out how they were going to deal with their segregation. And so they moved what had been a place preparing people for higher education at the highest level to becoming a teacher preparatory institution. To give you some idea of what kind of place the Institute for Colored Youth was, the head of it was Edward Boucher, a Black man who got a PhD in physics from Yale in 1874. But that's, again, all that has to do with the political maneuvering to keep us from having high quality access, high quality education. And most of those institutions, the prep schools we had, were shut down. The same phenomenon happened in New York City, where it was extremely successful. And as far as many white people were concerned, it was too successful. And that was one of the reasons there was such a battle about collegiate versus industrial education, because Hampton did not have a college program until the 1920s. And Tuskegee was teaching trades until the 20th century. Now, you just have to, again, go beyond. This is not like a varsity sport or something. The facts are very complicated.
Before we continue with the story, we could keep going on and on and on and on. But we skipped over one year, 1967, and that was significant because that's when you and I became brother-in-laws, right?
Well, that's when you married Cynthia.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, because she was my sister-in-law in 1963.
Right. Exactly. Right. When you got married. But so
yeah,
but I come on the scene in 67.
Well, that wasn't yesterday, but
no, it wasn't.
But 67, as you remember, was another one of those years where there was an increasing tempo of events that we can connect now because we look back. And
I was going to ask you that question as a way of summing up, using Malcolm X and his life as the lens. Can you take a couple moments and then kind of sum up why it's important to look at the history or through the lens of a historian? What's your parting message for the listening audience?
My message is that this is a golden age of historical studies and analyses of the Black experience globally.
You're talking about the 60s, the 1960s?
Well, no, not. I'm talking about in general, going back to slavery, going back to the international slave trade. I mean, we now have a perspective on slavery that is not just the Atlantic slave trade. So, for example, to take it back to Malcolm X, he seems to have known nothing about slavery in Saudi Arabia. So he's very devout about Mecca. Well, I've been to Jeddah, and you're in Jeddah on the port, on the pier at Jeddah. You look out on a clear day, you see Africa, and then you look around you, and you might just as easily be in parts of Harlem or U Street when we were students. All right, and slavery was not abolished in Saudi Arabia until 1958. So when I went there in the 1980s, there were all of these freedmen still in traditional roles. And they were, of course, originally of Sudanese descent. And you can't just, point to the white man, if in Malcolm X's terms. There was a Muslim-controlled slave trade. That's how so many Black people from Africa ended up in India. India had its indigenous Black people, but as Joseph Harris's work showed many decades ago, the slave trade across the Indian Ocean was very active. And there's not enough time in a lifetime to read and absorb all of that. I think to look back at the 60s and other periods, we have to read in order first to get the information, but then to interpret it in terms of our own analyses. As anyone who was ever my student in all the years I taught, I always wanted them to do their thinking, because first they had to get the information and they had to have some basis for their analysis. But it's more than a story, but everyone has an interpretation of that, because there can be multiple, as you know, multiple legitimate interpretations. And we have had a very complicated experience on these shores. So that the biggest error that is usually made is what I call the autobiographical error, where things are looked at in terms of an individual's experience. So people will say, yes, I know all about Howard University because I was a student there, and such and such and such happened, and that's what the institution is about. No? You could have been in the military, you had a military experience in your time. But if you look at, for example, the Black military experience from colonial times to the present, it puts it all in a very different perspective. So when I first read about the 5,000 Black troops and the American War for Independence, or the Black troops that saved Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans, or the Black troops in World War I, or the ones that were in the Spanish-American War with Teddy Roosevelt, that changed my understanding. And, we again like to think of ourselves on the victim end, but if you look at it from the Native American point of view, the Buffalo Soldiers were some terrible people, because we were involved in taking their land, and we were in the cavalries that pushed them back, and we were in on the movement of them from their native lands to wastelands. So it's our history is very complicated, and some people again misread things. So there are now people running around with lists of owners, Black owners of slaves. Well, there's a very simple explanation for that. Once it became possible for people to buy themselves out of slavery, then you could buy your wife, you could buy your children, and the master sold each one by one. And you were listed as the owner. Now that came to our benefit only once. When slavery was abolished in the District of Columbia, it was compensated abolition. So all of those Black men who had worked themselves out of slavery by earning enough money to buy themselves, and they bought their wife and they bought their children, when emancipation came, the federal government, the Treasury, paid them. And that gave them a start. And that's one of the reasons that some families in Washington, D.C. were prosperous early, because they were able to buy property and invest in businesses then. But now to call them slave owners, as I've seen some people do, is just a complete distortion.
Mm-hmm. Well, we are way over time, and not because I let it go over time. So that it was my job to be the timekeeper, but I thought the conversation needed some additional time, and appreciate you sharing your perspectives on what it was like being at Howard University in the late 1950s and early 1960s. How you gave us a little history of the student council at Howard University, the debate relating to Bayard Rustin and Malcom X, and giving us a historian's perspective on history. And we appreciate that very much. So Dr. Michael Winston, thank you very much for joining us. And everyone else, I invite you to read our blogs and provide comments. I invite you to share your thoughts, your big thoughts, or tiny thoughts, any kind of thoughts. And join us again next week live at 5 p.m. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation.